So welcome everybody. Our presentation is called Mestizaje, Decolonization and Indigenization, Disputes, Questions, and Complexities. Um, my name is Maria Jose. I'm going to introduce myself in a second. First of all, I want to make an outland acknowledgement. More so to acknowledge that I'm an uninvited visitor in Musqueam land, mostly, but also Squamish and tsleil I'm contacting you all from Vancouver, BC, where I have been an uninvited visitor for the past 7 years, overall 10 years. But I raise my hands high in gratitude for this beautiful land that I have been living on and trying to work in the most respectful way. And I also raise my hands for the caregivers of this land and and the history of this land and the tradition of this land, and with whom some of them I had the privilege of working with alongside. I have tried to learn the Hicamanic language. It wasn't my forte, and I've been trying to behave in the way that I was taught by my elders and my grandparents. And we're gonna present here the work of three non-invited visitors to this beautiful land. So the agenda today, we're gonna give a little introduction to the title. Then each one of us presenters are gonna talk for a little bit. I'm gonna go first, and then Aurea will come next, then Samuel Rocha, and then we're gonna make a little activity to try to bring it back to you. So we're gonna model a little bit our own journey and our own ancestry and heritage, and then how we make sense of that in the Canadian context in Vancouver, and how we try to bring it also in our work as educators. And then we're gonna invite you to do a little activity that way, and then we'll have a conversation in the closing. So, mestizaje, and I want to say it the way we say it in Spanish in Mexico, because it's not mestiz, it's not mestizaje, it's mestizaje, and that's how we're trying to conceptualizing, pushing the boundaries, and we'll go a little bit in depth on how each one of us understand that within the context of decolonization or decolonizing and indigenizing. And I also wanted to bring into the centerpiece the image that we picked to represent our work, which is an image, a beautiful work from Diego Rivera, and who he painted himself is that little boy holding the hand of the Katrina, the carcass, the old lady, deaf lady that you can see as a skeleton there. Behind him is Frida Kahlo holding a yin yang figure. And on the left of the full image, this is just an extract of it, is the colonial history of Mexico, starting from the coming of the Spaniards and then everything until that point, we could say. And then beside Frida and Diego, there's two famous writers at the time. And in front of them, those two women that you see, the one in red and the one in blue, the one in red is representing the wife of Porfirio Diaz, a big dictator in Mexico history for 30 years, and his daughter, the second wife. And then on this side, there's like other important representatives of Mexican history. And then if you go further that way, there's like a lot of peasants and it represents a revolution and why not. So this piece is called Day Walking in the Alameda, so in the center of Mexico City. And it brings together a little bit of that complexity of cultures colliding, trying to make sense to each other, bringing a lot of indigenous traditions and at the same time European traditions, but a mix of that that gets in a complex way. So that's why we picked this space. If you have a chance to see it, it used to be in La Alameda, so in Mexico City downtown, which is a very representative part of Mexican history, but it also has a lot of meaning to me because I worked in the Alameda for 10 years. And I saw the change within those 10 years, although we're talking about the 2000s. This is a piece of the 1943, if I don't get it wrong. So my name is Maria Jose Atia Martinez, and I was born in La Gran Tenochtitlan in Mexico City. But since I was 2 years old, my parents moved to the Mayan territory, or the Mayan land, traditional land, and that's where I grew up. My background comes from, or my raising and growing up comes from like playing in the beautiful Caribbean Ocean, and the mangroves, and listening to Mayan radio more so than that Spanish radios, and having these um the state where I grew up was turning from territory to state. So we weren't really Mexico, but we were Mexico. So we needed the passport to go into another state. So there were a lot of complexities. I bet most of you have heard of Cancun as a tourist destination. When I was growing up, when I moved to that land, again as an uninvited visitor, um, there were two hotels, and so the place where I grew up is very different than the one you could experience nowadays. Um, but there's still a lot of places that continue taking care of that land, not only taking care of that land, but not letting capitalism and colonialism get into it to take it on as tourist places. And these pictures that I showing you right now are from an island that I was living before moving to Vancouver, which is in Holbox. The two ones in the corners, and the one in the center is from like where I grew up. Again, fisherman town, Mayan territory. We use the word mestizaje to represent the mix of cultures. And while it has been used for certain colonial purposes within the Mexican history and within the case that they created to separate each other and put it a little bit more in boxes so we can relate with each other. So um, my ancestry, which I call mestiza, as coming from mestizaje, is pretty complex, as you can tell here. So I have background on my great grandfather's side, on my father's side, my parental side coming from Lebanon, Alejandro Atiesad, who married Manuela Carrasco, coming from Spain, from Madrid. And then my grandfather, the son of the Lebanese Alejandro and the Spaniard Manuela, married my grandmother, whose family came from the Basque Country around here in Spain. And they all arrived to Mexico in the mid 1800s. And then on my mother's side, my grandmother on my mother's side was her mother came from England, her father came from France. They were running away from the two wars, the First and the Second World War, and they, my grandmother and all my grandparents were born in Mexico. All of the, yeah, most in Mexico, two in Mexico City. The one coming from the Basque Country was born in Guanajuato. And then my grandfather on my mother's side, his ancestry came from Guerrero State, which is around here. And he had a mixed ancestry coming from up north and from south. For some reason, that grandfather, Horacio Martínez Romero, which I have found that the Romero last name comes also from an indigenous group in the US. And I found that information in the book of Cordova. For some reason, I have a lot of memories spending time with my grandparents. And a lot of those memories are also learning about my family history as if it was kind of my role as a female and being the first one in my own nuclear family, but also the first granddaughter on my dad's side. It was kind of my role to learn all those things. And then I kind of took it on me. And then from there, I'm trying to make sense of who I am now. So this is a picture of my grandparents on my father's side, on my mother's side, sorry, and my grandfather on my mother's side. And these are my uncles. So my mom comes from a family who has, she's the 9 out of 11 children, 12 because then one was adopted. So she will be the 10th out of 12 here when they are young. And then this is my mother's side. Are my cousins until then. I am here in the center. We end up being 34. So I come from a really big families. My second last name Martinez. We are a very, very big family, also on the FPS side. This is just to give you a little bit of context of my upbringings. And those upbringings, in both sides of my family, there was a huge, um, very grounded in Catholicism perspectives, but there was a huge drive to um, put in our hearts, in each one of our hearts of family members, to be in service of others. And so, um, for one reason or the other, I ended up in education. And the reason why this picture was taken, I was there in Cantepec de Candayoc, Oaxaca, one of the projects that I was working at, supporting the development of one of the first public and private intercultural and indigenous universities in Mexico. Um, there are only two of those. There are seven that are public and intercultural and indigenous. And this was an initiative of the community. And here was the full community trying to make it happen because the Ministry of Education in Mexico, la Secretaría de Educación Pública, was saying that they needed proper buildings and proper classrooms. And so the whole community gathered together so we could have all the requirements in place in order to have the validation from the government to open the university. But I wanted to bring this picture into the center just to show kind of like this was the way I grew up in a little town in Cancun, in which we all helped each other when there was a need of having a cultural place. We will gather together and we will all build it. It had no difference between social class or your ancestry. We will all work as a community. And the work that I have done later on in my life as an educator has been mostly working in projects that are led by Indigenous people, and is by following their needs that we create and develop educational projects that respond to those needs. And they're still ongoing and in place until nowadays because they are community projects. So I just feel that I'm a facilitator or a person that passed by and has the honor to support or be one of those people that are trying to put up a roof and make it in the ways that the government is asking us. So we fulfill the protocol that is required by the government, but we're doing it the way we do it. And at the end of the day, we're building this university with the materials and in the way that makes sense to the community. And yeah, again, I want to bring it up to represent that. And the work that I've been doing in UBC as a PhD candidate, whatever that means, in curriculum studies, um, it's it. I've been working for my dissertation with non-Indigenous teachers, understanding that my role here in Canada is as a non-Indigenous teacher as a non-Indigenous person for as much as I could have ancestry of indigeneity within my own ancestry. But I receive as an international student privileges that come with colonialism. And in this work, I have um, in the work of reconciliation that I'm trying to write about, finishing up finally, if it will ever finish my dissertation. Um, I try to bring the teachings that I have learned throughout my life, not only the teachings of my grandparents and my ancestors, but also the teachings of the elders that I had the privilege to work with. And it's through those teachings, and it's through those ancient traditions that I bring the Mexica dance as part of a metaphor and a methodology, a metaphor for reconciliation in which we all create a circle of trusting people, circle where we go one step at a time, trying to make this concept of reconciliation within education a concept that is active, that is not static, that we all get involved one way or the other, and that we all share the mistakes together in reflection, trying to go one step at a time. And I bring it also here now as an offering, as a representation of who I am here in Canada, and who is trying to make sense of my own reality within the educational realm in curriculum studies. And with that, I pass it on to you, Ari.
Thank you, Maria Jose. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Maria Jose, for that opening for sure, and for the opportunity of being together, talking and sharing reflections that the three of us have been pondering for a few months, I think. Because of unexpected circumstances, I found myself joining you today, actually from my homeland, Mexico City, and actually from my maternal grandmother's house. So I guess it was meant to be here to talk about mestizaje, about ancestry, and really to invite us all to look into the visible and invisible aspects of our roots and how those play out in our roles and our responsibilities as educators or maybe as citizens in Canada. So I am as well an uninvited guest in the territories of the Coast Salish Nations since 10 years ago. But through this brief autobiographical story that I'm sharing with you, I'm going to take you north from the beautiful Caribbean, where Maria Jose started us, into the jungle of asphalt in Mexico City, which is, again, where I was born. My own motivation to learn about mestizaje is relatively recent, and I'm been reflecting about it because of its close connection with the work that I'm doing, trying to support and work in collaboration with Indigenous communities in Canada and British Columbia specifically, and all the commitments and tensions that come with trying to uphold Indigenous self-determination, sovereignty, and the responsibilities that we have, again, as educators and in that case, as researchers. In my case, my story brings together two colonial protagonists, Spain and Mexico. My father, a Spaniard, and my mother, a Mexican woman. Again, never thought about exploring my Indigenous roots, and honestly, I have never been compelled to do so because of honestly ethical concerns. I don't feel that it's my position to claim any indigeneity, but it could be, at least based on the definitions that the colonial Spanish Empire brought here, that there are indigenous roots. As you can see, the reflections and the stories that we'll share tonight have very different gradients of depth in terms of how much we have learned and how much we have been able to learn about our roots. So in my case, unlike Maria Jose, my nucleus is quite small. My parents were lovers, so I don't have an extended family. And I will spare you the not so romantic parts of the story, but let's suffice to say that because of that reason, I didn't connect with my paternal side until I was 16 years old, that my father connected with me and he took me to Spain. And that's where I first connected to the land where he was born. And I was able to go to Tortosa, which is a very old town in the banks of the delta of the Ebro River, the longest river of Spain. And the house where my father was born was in the center of the city, very Catholic family, deeply rooted in that tradition, very opposite to my mother's atheist, passionate conviction. So a big contrast there. And through that, I was able to, can you click another time, Maria Jose? Thanks. Yeah, that just was that's the big market in front of my father's house. So unlike my paternal side, my maternal side is and has been very strong in my upbringing. This is my grandmother, the owner of the house where I am right now, and from whom I have the name that I have, Aurea Alfaro de la Vega. And that's her again. And the next one is me with her, very little in the same house. Well, not so little. Interestingly enough, it was through my grandmother that I connected with indigenous communities. We used to talk about her work as a teacher, educator, and her travels to the Sierra Tarahumara, which is the image that you see here. And through those trips where she would take her students, she would make connections with the indigenous communities there, and specifically with the Raramuri people. Raramuri are known as those of the light feet. You could translate that into English. And a very, very distinct and powerful and honestly impressive indigenous nation in Mexico, again in the Sierra Tarahumara. So those stories really sparked my curiosity to connect with indigenous peoples, and specifically with indigenous games. When the three of us came together to explore the idea of mestizaje, we had Mexico in mind. That is why the flag there. But as you will soon understand, that common root, as might be the case for some of you if you are Canadian or live in what is colonially known as Canada, that national origin is never as simple and straightforward as one would perhaps think initially. And that was the case for us. We noted, however, that those differences and the willingness to explore them and engage in conversations about our own histories has greatly informed the work that we do as educators, how we position ourselves as educators. And we were inspired to challenge in this case, the idea of mestizaje, again, as it is colonially defined in Mexico. So as a child of a Spaniard and a Mexican, I could be the prototypical mestiza in Mexico. Hence the painting here that I'm sharing with you. So based on that colonial definition, that's what I would be labeled as. And it's interesting to note that in Spain, the so-called mestizos had this intermediate position in the hierarchy between indigenous people and Spaniards. So they didn't have the privilege of the Spaniards, and they were not slaves like the blacks. They did not pay the same tribute as indigenous people. So they had this in-between space of privilege. And they also, because of that, developed interethnic communication skills and adopted and adapted many cultural and social elements from the different groups. So it's a very interesting positionality. And I think, at least for me and for what I can interpret of my colleagues, it gives you some sort of sociological dexterity and a lot of sensitivity into understanding those different layers, because that's where that type of identity was carved, if you will. The idea, of course, of mestizaje in Mexico is deeply loaded with whiteness, which, as we know, is central in many conversations about mestizaje in Mexico and obviously in Canada as well. And thanks to that, and thinking about that whiteness and what it means, it has been central into understanding why and how being engaged in these types of conversations that we're inviting you to have today, it's important because of the privilege that comes with it, that also Maria Jose was alluding to earlier, and also because of the questioning of that privilege. In Mexico, I also wanted to bring this up. The indigenous presence and the political significance of indigenous communities and nations is quite different than in Canada. And I was inspired to bring up this to you because, again, maybe we could talk about mestizaje and think that it's similar, but again, the political positionalities of nations are such that the differences are great and very much something to keep in mind. The history of indigenous movements in Mexico has been marked, obviously, by the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional. And what did strike me is that what does unite indigenous nations, perhaps across the world, is this willingness of having a world where many worlds fit, which is what it says here, ¿no? Queremos un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos. This is something that I've heard from elders as well in Canada, in British Columbia. And it's again connected with the beautiful and rich complexity and diversity of indigenous nations, and with recognizing the differences in experiences that are sharing the common struggle of colonialism, but at the same time that challenge the divisions that, for example, come with the idea of mestizaje or the hierarchies that colonial systems have been imposing upon indigenous communities and that have been passed on through generations, as I was trying to illustrate with my case. I also wanted to mention, because we were also discussing that in the description, that at least for me, the idea of being an ally is not something that I contemplate for myself. on the one hand, because I don't think I have the right to define myself in such terms, and also because I acknowledge that experiences like those lived by the Indigenous peoples in Canada, such as the residential schools and ongoing and systemic oppression and exploitation and dispossession of land, is not an experience that I am having, and I don't, and I won't be able to understand that. So trying to be humble in just standing and listening and witnessing and learning from elders and learning from Indigenous leaders about what they consider be a priority, a prerogative in their fight and in their lives, is what I'm striving to do through my own work and what I have been taught by following them in my journey in Canada. And before passing into Sam, I just wanted to mention one of those Indigenous leaders and thinkers, Dr. Dwayne Donald, whom I find could be a good person to reference. He's a Canada Research Chair in Reimagining Teacher Education with Indigenous Wisdom Traditions. And I just included this short excerpt from one of his articles. Things were not as they were assumed to be. So our interpretations of each other, our interpretations of what mestizaje is, what our backgrounds are just a first layer, a first veil that we invite you, hopefully today and through your practice, to unveil and to explore further, hopefully with us tonight, as we share our own stories and hopefully we learn about yours as well. Thank you. I'll pass it to Sam.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Thank you to Maria Jose and Aurea for inviting me to be a part of this workshop on mestizaje. So I'll just kind of jump directly in. You know, it's common whenever my last name is spoken that people will sometimes pronounce it as Roca, or I often will anglicize my last name as Rocha. And I learned not too long ago that it has a Portuguese etymology that if someone is from Brazil, for instance, they would pronounce it Rocha. So even in some sense for me, mestizaje begins in a way from the very fact that I can't be overly possessive about the sort of proper pronunciation of my last name. It's etymologically Portuguese, it's ethnically Mexican, it's functionally anglicized, and so I generally don't get offended at all when people so-called mispronounce my last name, because perhaps I do too. So that's the last name from my father's side. Montaño is the last name from my mother's side, and David is my middle name. This image here also introduces our geographic journey from the south to the north. So I was born in a town called Brownsville, Texas. It is directly across from the Mexican town of Matamoros in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas, and the state of Brownsville is in Texas. And this image here is a very, in some ways, bizarre image, because it's an official state document of the state of Texas with a seal of the Mexican nation, both a press seal and an ink seal, and it shows an appended document that has been literally glued onto my birth certificate document in Texas. And you can see there the town I was born in, Brownsville, Texas. This was a bit of I mean, the circumstances under which I got this were related to the fact that I grew up not only in what's called the Rio Grande Valley, which is a particular region of Texas, South Texas, right along the border, but also for around 5 years in Reynosa, Mexico, which is just north of Matamoros, but still along the same pathway of the Rio Grande River. That river is oftentimes considered the southernmost border of the United States. However, it became the southernmost border of the United States, or at least a portion of it became the southernmost border of the United States after a 19th century treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And whenever that treaty was signed between the United States and Mexico after the end of a very short conflict, the Mexican-American War, every person who lived north of that border, who was ethnically and nationally Mexican, simply became American. And so we have a kind of a funny saying, I guess, in the region that I come from, that would apply to both sides of my family, both the ones in New Mexico as the ones in South Texas, that we say, La frontera nos cruzó. La frontera is the border, and nos is us, and cruzó is crossed us. So the claim is that essentially we did not cross the border crossed us. When we get into the details of the map, my ancestry, we can say with the map, yeah, it gets a bit more specific. My father's side is the green line. The reason it starts from the Iberian Peninsula region of Portugal is because of the etymology of my last name, Rocha, which is also Rocha in Portuguese, and also my grandmother's last name, which is Vela, which is also a very common Portuguese last name. I only know through speculation, but there is there are some consequential historical theories that crypto-Judíos who were fleeing the Spanish Inquisition within the Iberian Peninsula made their way to Portugal, and as quickly as they could boarded ships to the so-called New World. But upon arrival, they did not want to necessarily live in the ultra-Catholic colonial settings of the South, and so they made their way north. And one of the indicators, for instance, of the probability of this theory is the fact that many norteño foods, for instance, are kosher and other things like that. But nonetheless, these are at some level speculations. Anyhow, so my speculation is that these ancestors left the Iberian Peninsula on the borders of Portugal, probably arrived at one of the major ports, whether it was Veracruz or along the major Mexican coastline, but at some point made their way north, where my grandparents were born in a ranch called La Reforma Ranch in a town close to a town called San Isidro, Texas, which is just between San Antonio and Laredo, Texas, which Laredo is next to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. So that's the region. Where this gets somewhat interesting is that my grandmother, who married my grandfather, was always colloquially referred to as, La India, or the Indian, as an indigenous person. And I became aware over the last 10 years of the particular history of Apache women within South Texas. And that led me on a series of investigations that I was able to find out very recently that her nicknames and whatnot were not simply colloquialisms, but there was some historical reality to them, and that she was an Apache, a Lipan Apache woman who married Crescencio Rocha, a Mexican man. Her name was Margarita, or Mage. And the Apache, of course, migrated to South Texas, in many cases later than the Mexican migration north, because they lost a particular war with the Comanche Nation, a very powerful nation of Plains tribe, with a powerful alliance to the Navajo. And prior to that, we know as well that the Apache actually originated with the Navajo in the Athabascan region of what actually would be modern day Canada. So that's where that line goes as far up as Canada. And that traces my grandmother. So on my paternal side, I have an Indigenous great-grandmother married to a Mexican great-grandfather, and the family kind of emerges within that particular type of mestizaje, very similar to the kind of basic formula that Aurea discussed and talked about. I have similar, I think, feelings about it, in the sense that my attitude about it is probably more historical than it is genealogical. Yet at the same time, I'm still in some ways almost working through what genealogical attachments are appropriate or not in this relationship. On my mother's side, we actually have a very robust history thanks to Catholic baptismal records that traces my grandfather's name was Pedro Esteban Montaño, and there was a Pedro. I don't know about the middle name Esteban, but I know that there were Pedro Montaños that we can find generationally going back to the 16th century, all the way to the Iberian Peninsula, to Spain, on one of either the second or the third expedition of soldiers leaving Spain for the so-called New World. So we know quite definitively from the Montaño side that they were originally soldiers that first arrived as subjects to the king and queen, Isabella and Fernando, in Tenochtitlan, or Mexico City, where Aurea is sitting right now. And their work of about 200 years was actually in the building of various forms of royal roads, or Camino Real. And the Camino Real that they worked particularly on was the Camino Real between Mexico City and Santa Fe, New Mexico, or what today we call New Mexico, but Santa Fe, the city. And after around 200 years, they apparently, for whatever reasons, got quite tired of being security guards, basically, on a road, that they stopped traveling south and they just stayed in the north in New Mexico. They settled in Canjilon, New Mexico. So this is an image of my great-grandfather. That's Crescencio Rocha with the mustache. And to his left is Margarita Rocha. And so he is the Mexican man, fairly prototypical with the mustache and everything, really. And my indigenous great-grandmother, an Apache woman. There's a lot of history behind the Apache, but I don't want to take too much time to get into that. But nonetheless, there's a whole geopolitics to that. On the following slide, we see the burial site of my grandparents. So Andres Rocha was the son of Crescencio and Margarita Rocha. And you can see the V for Elida. That's the vela. This is in some sense, incorrect technically in terms of the way the names are. But this is also very typical of my family and my region. It's really a region of peasants and workers, animal workers, vegetable workers, migrant workers. Some of the proprieties, perhaps, of certainly Spanish colonial things are kind of lost on my people. So they kind of, things get made up a lot. This is pretty typical in terms of this gravestone. The one thing that doesn't get made up or messed with too much, though, is their Catholicism. And so you can also see on the grave there the tiled floor that one of my tíos thought was a good idea to build, and of course the giant shrine to Our Lady of Guadalupe and stuff. So that gives you a sense of this. This whole graveyard also contains the remains of my great-grandparents and of another very significant figure within my family that adds complexity to my story. But I'm going to keep my story fairly truncated for time. The following slide shows a place that I can't really disclose without violating some trust in my family, but it is pertinent to my mother's side of the family. And that cross right there has been standing in that particular place since around the 1930s. And it was a place where so after my Montaño side decided to stop running security for the King and Queen of Spain on the Royal Road, they became pastores de ovejas, shepherds. And they would run sheep between Canquilon. They would be born, the sheep would get born there, and they would be weaned off the milk there and stuff. And then they would leave on a journey that would take them all the way across the New Mexican and Colorado border, and then across the Colorado-Utah border, and they would be sold at a railroad station where they would be purchased in full. They would have a stopping point though, where they would gather to have something like a religious service, and so they would leave all the sheep in a single meadow from all the different shepherds, and they would only the men would walk up this mountain, and they would have this particular service. This religious service became a very kind of almost in some tension with the traditional religious services of the missions. And at one point in time, this group was even excommunicated because they were seen as not having their services in the proper places and according to the proper rituals of the Catholic Church. And they acquired the name that for some is very famous and for others very infamous of the penitentes. And so they would have been a group of pre-missionary Catholics who, again, they didn't get there primarily for reasons of mission. They were basically dropout soldiers who became shepherds. It's very difficult for me to imagine that the Montaño line of my family is quite as pure as it loves to think it is. It really thinks of itself as Spanish. And for many years, I was like, that's impossible. However, the genealogical research I've done does show me that the line, at least of the Pedro Montaños, is fairly intact, and that they were so obsessed with the sort of purity of their family that there was a lot of intermarriage. And so like my great grandparents on this side were both first cousins. Yikes. So the degree to which this group were mestizos in that classical formula, or were mestizos more through just time and generational transition, it's not clear to me. But anyhow, this is a very particularly sacred site for my family, and hopefully still completely undisclosed location in the bush in Colorado. These are the grave sites of my two grandparents. In this case, I got the Pedro Montaño, so you could see right there. That is in Canquilon, New Mexico, and a small gravesite. Canquilon, by the way, is a town of, I think the registry says like 35 people. You have to go to the park ranger's office to even be able to find it, much less to find the cemetery. So we're not talking here. Neither side of my family are urbane people. So, you know, there's no concrete jungles around here. On my grandmother's side, my grandma Carolyn, her last name was Zamora Lucero, and she's actually buried in a graveyard near Farmington, New Mexico. And so you can even see, though, by the language on the grave sites that my mother's family is probably more enculturated, I'd say, into kind of the United States. The native language for both of my grandparents was Spanish, but my mother's side were quite bilingual, whereas my father's side, they refused to speak English. I don't even know if they could. I know my grandfather read a lot of English because he'd get his bills and stuff. And I was like, how do you even pay your bills? But so I suspect he knew more than he let on. So for me, Mestizaje is fraught not only by the classical formula that Aurea discussed and the intertensions and complexities of families, but it's also localized within a national context that is not ostensibly explicitly Mexican by nationality, and it's not. I mean, I'm by no means like a minority in the United States. Actually, Hispanics are the largest minority group in the United States now, and Mexican Americans are the largest group within that group. But there have been a lot of movements over the years to, including movements that wanted to theorize mestizaje in a way that would make sense for explicitly Mexican Americans. Gloria Anzaldua's subtitle to her book is The New Mestiza. I have to say that for my part, at least, I never really affiliated myself, nor would presently see myself reflected in, for instance, the Mexican American movement or the Chicano movement. Our families were not a part of any of the worker movements or the strikes or the huelgas or Cesar Chavez. They were fairly hardworking, fairly conservative, fairly obedient, fairly poor. No one went to school. So I still, I suppose, struggle even within the kind of authorized mestizajes available for the Mexican American to find my way in that group. And as Aurea and Maria Jose know, I'm now sitting in Canada as a professor. I hope to maybe at some level make good on some of those difficulties by doing some theorizing of my own into the concept, and hopefully I can do that in a good way, in a respectful way, but also in a way that advances the I don't want to say the project of mestizaje, but I almost do want to say that because it's become a very unpopular project for very good reasons across Latin America and across those who are conversant with the term. It may seem to some people even odd that 3 self-identifying Mexicans would even want any attachment or affiliation to the term in some ways. I think what unites us, though, is a sense that there is a constructive potential despite the false starts of that project, and I'm not closed off to the idea that maybe there is something available in that project if it's understood with enough subtlety and enough complexity and enough rigor, of course, as well. So that, for my part, is kind of my story, and I think it is a lovely. I hadn't recognized until Arya said it. Kind of journey from the far, Mayan south that may not even be Mexico to the heart of Mexico in Tenochtitlan, to the north that is also on the treaty defined border. So in some ways this is a really beautiful spectrum of mestizaje, and I'm just grateful to be able to be here and think about it with you all.
Thank you both. So we've been talking about this, and yesterday Sam said out loud, it's funny that we're going to present in English when we'll be discussing this in Spanish for the longest time. and I even although a colonial language too, of course, for us. But and anywhere, but particularly I just can't see myself using another kind of similar term because of all the layers and history and all the implications that means for us. But then why these 3 Mexican people that are trying to make sense of our own identities, if we identify ourselves as mestizos or not, or one label of codes or the other, why are we bringing this today here in the Canadian context and in education? And in order to do so, we want to extend our invitation to you, having the privilege of having some of you here, whomever feels comfortable doing it, and I'm going to share with you an activity that I learned after attending a workshop with Nikki Sanchez and Jacqueline Jennings, and they did this exercise as part of their decolonial process in a decolonial workshop, and I have found it fascinating every time myself, and Ben Wells reproduced it, but also I have used it for my students. And so the invitation is for each one of you to introduce yourself, of course your name, but introduce yourself through your grandmother on your maternal side. So what is or what's her name? And if you know the maiden name, what do you know about your grandmother and your mother's side. Where was she born, and where did she spend most of her life? And also, in which indigenous land was she born, and in which indigenous land she spent most of her life. And this activity, we want to do it just as an invitation to for each one of us to explore our identities. So, should I go first? Because I didn't do it actually the way you did it, Sam and Aurea. Okay. So my grandmother on my mother's side, her name is Maria del Carmen Duhat Nid. Those were her two maiden last names. She was born in Mexico City, which is Nahuatl land. She was the daughter of this man who was a widow, and he adored my grandmother, and everybody treated my grandmother as like the queen. And the queen of that family, or the princess, decided to marry the Indian man, as just Sam said. And so it was for the family of my grandmother was like, "What are you doing?" The father said no 3 times to my grandfather when he went to ask the hand of her. Anyways, but she really fell in love with my grandfather, and they moved to live in a community in Guerrero, and where my grandfather did his social service as a doctor, and they barely had money, but somehow they had 11 children, and and uh, and my grandmother lived most of her life in Mexico City. At the end of her life, she moved to Cancun, and my parents had the privilege to take care of her at the latest part of her life. Um, and so she basically lived in the Mexica land, Aztec land, as you might have known it, or Nahuatl, and then she moved to the Mayan territory. And in the in between, she lived in Tlachislahuaca territory in Guerrero.
Hi, I can go. Okay. My name is Jennifer Bug. Well, my grandmother, his name was Eleanor Bolton. Her maiden name was Olin. She was born and lived, I think, all of her childhood. It was Aurelia, Ontario, and it's located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, and Rama First Nations. Her mother, his name was Georgina McLeod, and she came from the Abitibi Métis First Nations, or the Abitibi Métis community of Moose Factory, Ontario. And so she's a Métis woman who left her community in order to avoid the racism and the risk of residential schools. So that is me.
Thank you, Jennifer.
I can go next. Can you hear me well? Because it's not the greatest microphone I have.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. I'm actually from Germany. I'm from Berlin. So this is, as you probably know, in Europe, the borders moved a lot. So when Sam talked about the border moved us, I'm sure that especially in the Eastern European between Poland and Germany, this happened many times. And my grandmother, maternal side, I know her maiden name. I know that she was a pediatric nurse. I know that she had sisters and brothers, but I cannot remember how many. She is a person who passed away when I was 11, I believe. And she had cancer, and her sister had the same cancer. I think 3 of the sisters died on the same cancer. And when we speak about them, we talk about how they dealt with stress because during the war, what they had to experience. And I know a lot more about my other grandmother because I spent a lot of time with her from my paternal side, but maternal side, she was very sick. And I just know from my mom's talk that she was very, she was not a warm mother. She did not hug very much or hardly ever. She just functioned. She made sure everything functioned. So that's what I know about her. So I don't know very much. But she also lived most of her life in Berlin. And I'm not 100% sure where she comes from, but my grandfather, the one who she married, spent a little bit more time on the Polish side, which is then became Germany and then Poland. So, but they all ended up in Berlin. That's what I know.
Thank you for sharing, Christine. My grandmother wasn't very hugging or close either, just as you referred to. She was functioning, and I guess she had 11 children and then 12, and then so many grandkids that, yeah.
Yeah, I know one really interesting story because maybe that is a neat story to hear. Is my mother is the last born of 4 children, so with a gap of 4 years. So her 3 brothers and sisters are 4, 5, and 6 years older, and then my mom was born right in the war, and at that time Hitler had promised to all women if they give birth in in a certain war hospital, which was right under the Reichstag building, they would give the mothers a bank account, like a
Yeah.
savings account. And my grandmother, when she was in labor, she went on the bus just to get there to get the money. She made it and she got the money. So that's one of the things, which is a little bit of a historical. And all the children born in that war hospital received a document that Hitler is the godfather of the children who were born there. But of course, it didn't have any value. No way. Like, he didn't really do anything. But my mother feels very embarrassed having this document, and many times she wanted to throw it out. And I always tell her, don't. This is such an important piece of history. Don't throw it out. And she feels horrible that she had Hitler as her godfather. Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
We have a message in the chat. It says, Gwen Collier, my granny was born in Nova Scotia on the ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq. Her family moved to the prairies when she was a little child to a small town with one-room schoolhouse. The family eventually moved to the BC coast right on the shore of Trout Lake in Burnaby. She lived for the rest of her days on the lands of Musqueam and Tsawwassen because she went to UBC and met her husband there. She was a mischievous, hilarious, spunky woman who loved playing cards and dancing parties. I love that. Loved it.
Thank you for sharing, Brooke.
My maternal grandmother is actually the one with the most, probably, it's the most complex single line of the kind of the 4 paternal and maternal grandparents. She also lived the longest of the 4. So she passed away during the COVID pandemic. And her mother, Carolyn, who I showed, her husband, last name Lucero, died. He drowned actually in the San Juan River in New Mexico. And they had quite a few children by that point. And so she remarried a man by the last name of Hancock. And he was not only of Irish ancestry, he was also Mormon. And his family came west invariably either as Mormons or members of the American Army. It was common at the time for Irish immigrants to arrive to Ellis Island and be sort of commissioned directly into the American military because they just needed kind of bodies. But that particular remarriage and that creation of this Hancock line alongside the Lucero line has, to this very day, created a massive divide in my maternal grandmother's family, which is precisely along the lines of mestizaje, whiteness, and all these things. So I think my grandmother really was attracted in many ways to the simplicity and kind of purity of my grandfather's Montano Spanish heritage, and they very much kind of use that as their identifier. But as I went to family reunions and understood, I realized that on her side of the family, things were much more complex. People did identify as Mexican, whereas on my grandfather's side, the Montaños never identified that way. They would say, no, it was Hispanic, for instance. Although this is also a bit strategic because they did open the first Mexican restaurant in this little town of Cortez, Colorado. So I suppose when it was convenient for business, they could adopt different and multiple identities. But yeah, but she was and is really the only line of my grandparents and great grandparents that is not explicitly or recognizably within that kind of mestizaje formula of indigenous or Iberian or Mexican descent.
Thank you, Sam. Well, I guess because of the time that we 15 minutes away, the idea of thinking of our own heritage and our own grandmothers on our mother's side was an invitation to start to think of these categories. We introduce you to this mestizaje, not only as a concept or how it has been used in terms of history, and maybe nowadays or by some scholars like Ansaldúa, Sam mentioned, but we also introduce you our own kind of complexities within this understanding of concept or how we live it or how we just happen to have it, right? Because it's not that we have chosen the heritage we have, we just have it. But for us, it was important to bring these concepts into the conversation today with you all. To try to push a little bit the boundaries of those paradigms or fixed categories that sometimes can limit us and sometimes can bring us a jumping. But how can we start an understanding together of certain fixed categories and how do we make sense of it in our own identity and in our own professions? Aurea talked a little bit about the allyship concept. And this is something that her and I have discussed extensively, particularly because of this idea that she expressed before, but also because we don't want to self-identify. And I don't know if I want somebody to call me an ally either, honestly. I understand that it's into points we're kind of in a war or in complete contradictions of concepts and theories and embodiments. But at least as I situate myself as an uninvited visitor here, we're trying to find ways to uphold and uplift the work of Indigenous people, and particularly in education, and support in any way possible. But it's an invitation also to explore our positionalities, explore our ancestries. I truly believe, and I think I can speak for my colleagues too, that knowing our ancestry, it also gives you not only knowledge of where we're standing and where we come from, but also a different understanding of our present and our present in where we are, and a different understanding of our present also in our profession. So in this case, as educators or facilitators or supporters or whatever you want to see it. And so it's an invitation to contest and explore at the same time those identities that bring us today, where we are to who we are, but also that somehow, or somewhat, they influence our decisions. And at least in my case, they deeply influence my interest in the work that I do, and kind of like that sprinkle of being in service for others and understanding others, or listening to those stories and the stories of how my ancestors came, particularly from my grandfather's side, that explained to me multiple times that it was important for me to learn all my last names as far as I could get, because maybe one day it'll be important for me. And he also explained multiple times our family history, um, how that had influenced where I am now and the work that I do, at least in my particular case. Now I'm gonna pass it to you, Sam and Aurea, to give your approaches to these kind of like concluding remarks.
I honestly was more curious about hearing about our other participants. I feel that I have talked a lot, and I'm honestly curious to also perhaps learn a little bit and open up the possibility of creating and expanding these types of conversations with others. Also happy to obviously answer any questions that might be in the minds of any of those who are joining us. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, if no one else has anything to say, one note I might make in terms of my own journey on this is a lot of times I think there could be a view that by doing research into your own family tree or genealogy, you will kind of acquire kind of like a stronger sense of identity. I think one of the lessons of Mestizaje is that maybe that's the case if you have a very localized, stable, particular type of life. I can think, for instance, of people with very rural lives who have largely stayed within a very small radius and time and stuff, and that would make sense. But I think when we find ourselves in these kinds of institutions, there is a sense that doing work to find out about one's family relations and relations more broadly actually in some sense decenters your sense of self and actually brings you to encounter yourself as a question and even as a kind of as a type of problem. And I think that, like, for a lot of people who are racialized in any kind of a way or has some historical relationship within the kind of colonial project, most of the colonial project has simply centered around one basic question, which is, who is a person? Who gets to be a person? The definitions that Aurea was talking about in terms of how many taxes do you pay? Can you be enslaved or not? Do you have the rights of another person? They all baseline or a basic question of like, what does it mean to be a person, and who is a person, and who is not? And I think that whenever that becomes not only a political question, but also an existential question, which is like, who am I? We can encounter forms that may not be mestizaje explicitly historically, but that nonetheless have the same effect. In that by trying to figure out who we are, we lose some sense of certainty around the security or the certainties of our identity. And I think my colleagues, I think I can speak on their behalf, but if not, I at least speak on my own. The political project of truth and reconciliation and the commitments to decolonization and to indigenization, I don't think any of us are in any way doubtful at all about that project and that work. But I think there are some questions emerging around the fixation upon a particular type of identity politics that becomes, and a kind of fixation on a kind of certainty around identity that can sometimes almost overtake the basic project. And I know all three of us, we've done fairly extensive community-based work within Indigenous communities, explicit Indigenous communities in Canada. And anyone who's done that will tell you that questions of identity and question of who is an enrolled member of our band, where do we make the cut, whose children count, whose children get benefits, who is the band going to finance and pay for. These are open and wide and you know, questions, and I think they're very much questions within the same realm of the kinds of questions that Mestizaje can raise, without necessarily using Mestizaje as a solution for everything. I think it is a gesture towards what we can do. Daniel, I saw you turn on your video, so maybe you want to jump in.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I just quickly shared something in the chat. Yeah, I'm also, so I'm Chinese, but like immigrated to Canada, and also I'm Canadian now, I guess. And so mestiçage is really interesting concept for me. And yeah, as a graduate student, I'm interested in researching more and potentially using that as a methodology. I have come across Dwayne Donald as well. And yeah, I'm hoping to explore further. And because I'm working with non-Indigenous pre-service teachers in teacher education at UBC, I'm like looking at like how can we explore our positionalities as teachers, and in relationship to decolonizing and indigenizing and EDI and sustainability as well. So yeah, even though I'm not like ethnically hybrid, like I guess you could kind of argue in terms of regionally, like being from like such a big country, like there might be regional differences, but generally I feel very linguistically and culturally, the identity is such a complex thing when you have like crossed borders and like lived in different countries and you pick up different cultures, and and then you kind of feel like, oh, I feel neither, and this kind of, yeah, kind of you're just really adjusting and analyzing who you are. And so yeah, and sorry I missed a bit of the beginning, but I hope to watch the video. And but thank you so much for sharing and doing this. I guess I'm just, yeah, I may or may not have questions. I'm just kind of formulating my thoughts as well, because it's like I'm interested in exploring this more, and just not sure to what extent I will be able to engage it in research, and also um being respectful of like all the different diverse realities and complexities that are involved in mestiçage. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Danielle. You bring a particular case, and in a way, you're touching those borders that Sam was mentioning. That the more you get into it, the less fixed it is, right? The more complex it gets, and sometimes it could be the more unsettling at the same time. And I guess this invitation to extend the conversation that we've been having, the three of us, to everybody, is just a way to also put our thoughts out there and try to make sense of these things that we've been thinking about it, and somehow we're supposed to embody, and or we're challenging it, with an invitation to think further together, with our arguments, and trying to involve all the complexities that they can be, but I bet there are way more. So thank you for sharing.
The one thing I would note is that there are distinctions that probably make a difference in terms of the formation of the concept of mestiçage versus the formation of mestizaje, namely that the mestizaje is basically the byproduct of the Iberian colonial project between Portugal and Spain, whereas the French project with France has its own distinct colonial characteristics and history. And so another thing that I think one finds doing what you might call broadly post-colonial work around these different things is that it forces one to really acknowledge the fact that we're never talking about, there's no such thing as colonialism. There's colonialisms. There's English colonialism and Dutch colonialism, French colonialism, and combined Iberian colonialism and Portuguese colonialism and Spanish colonialism. And the differences in terms of the formation of the kind of post-colonial projects across the Americas really make huge differences. And this is why I don't think that I can simply, for instance, be like, oh, it's the same word, I'm just Métis. No. Hell no. That doesn't make any sense at all. It's not only disrespectful, but it's just historically inaccurate, right? So I would be a little careful about making sure that if you do select sort of from that French line or for that more Canadian discourse, that you secure it to the historical apparatus that would make sense of it. And it may make sense here that that would be the right line. That would not be the same as the line of Mestizaje that we're drawing upon.
Thank you, Sam. And I guess thank you everybody for being here and for joining us to these thoughts and ideas and trying to make sense of these complex realities in terms.
Thank you, everyone.